Welcome to Tentacles and Turtlenecks, where a mind flayer booted from his dungeon acts like he has any business telling you how to run your own. Well, we've all been there, haven't we, watching as the horrible scene plays out. The bard walks up to the king of the most powerful nation in the world, a nation that king has devoted his entire life into building into an empire, and which is the most important thing to him in all of existence, and the bard demands that he hand over the crown and keys to the kingdom and step off of the throne so the bard can be king. Surely the king will laugh this off at best, or cut the bard's head off at worst. But then the unthinkable happens. The bard, unprompted, picks up his dice and rolls a natural 20 on a persuasion check. And the next thing you know, the former ruler of the most powerful empire in the world is now the court jester, and the bard is now the most powerful man in the land. And so goes the end of your epic tale of heroes struggling against the forces of darkness. Except, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. Summon the guards, off to the dungeon with the bard. Today's topic is how to manage ability checks. Ability checks are an interesting part of the game, of the world. A huge number of things your heroes and even your monsters can do is tied to a short list of skills and abilities. But how and when to use these abilities is often misunderstood. And since these are the bread and butter of social and exploration encounters, and a great way to add some spice to your combat encounters, it's important we really understand exactly what these things can do. First, let's start with the basics. What is an ability check and when is it used? Well, ability checks are fundamentally what happens when you need to check the success of an action. They're tied to a creature's ability scores like strength or intelligence, and are also often linked to skills like athletics or history. And when you toss that 20-sided rock to test the fates, the ability scores and proficiencies and skills add weight to that check. A creature high in strength and with skill and proficiency in athletics is going to be really impressive at physical feats, while a creature with low intelligence and lacking any knowledge skills is going to struggle to recall or locate useful information. Whenever the outcome of something isn't certain, that's when you use ability checks. But what situations actually warrant a roll of the dice? The heroes, after all, are seasoned adventurers. They're, simply speaking, better than the average person at what they do. It's reasonable that given enough time and resources, they could accomplish nearly anything, and so, in those cases, no rolling is needed at all. If the rogue has a locked chest but unlimited time, he's eventually going to get into it. The wizard has access to the entire library of the world's collected knowledge and enough time and help. She'll uncover whatever secrets she's after. Rolling for these situations is pointless. Just let them succeed. I mean, you don't have to roll to find the right page in your monster manual after all. In a similar vein, if there isn't any risk to what's being done, allow them the same benefit. If they want to open the sealed door in the dungeon and there are no monsters, no traps, and no rush to get the job done, they will inevitably succeed. So just let them. There's no point wasting time on something minor when we could get back to the exciting bits. Or, you probably shouldn't have left your dungeon's treasure room unguarded. Just saying. Finally, if an action is being attempted that is absolutely vital for the adventure to continue, there should never be any check made for it at all. The clue that's necessary for the investigation to succeed should always be found once the heroes arrive in the right place. The crossing of that shaky bridge should always succeed if the dungeon you intend to send them into is on the other side. That bit of historical lore that explains where they should go next needs to be understood if it's needed to progress the story. Never hold the entire campaign's progress hostage behind a roll of the dice. You'll only end up setting everyone up for disappointment if you do. And none of us want to be remembered as the big bad disappointing guy. There are 4 main situations that do call for ability checks. The first is when there's some risk to failure. Often risks like danger to the party, harm to the things they care about, or even a significant cost in time can urge adventurers to spend their resources like spell slots. But ability checks offer them a chance to defeat those things at no cost, making them very appealing to your average resource-strapped group. But the risk is that if they were to fail in their intended action, that the consequences then become reality. That is, the cost of success with a spell is up front, but the cost of failure with an ability check is on the back end. You fail the check and you pay the price. For example, a locked door might become inoperable after a failed attempt to pick the lock when the mechanism becomes jammed, and the warrior trying to bash it down might suffer some minor damage when the door just doesn't budge upon being smashed into, or it splinters into shrapnel when hit. Or more generally, failure wastes time, giving the enemy more opportunity to accomplish its goals, or for a roaming patrol to wander by and spot the group. Failing a check should always come at some cost. Second, they can be justified when there is no immediate risk, but there is opportunity to gain something extra. For instance, when searching the bandit captain's room for vital information, the party's always going to uncover that mandatory bit of information about where the bandits are headed next, so they can pursue. But you may want them to roll to investigate the room anyway, and add some additional details that can only be uncovered on a success. Perhaps there's incriminating information there that can be used to blackmail that bandit captain into retreat, or cause his henchmen to abandon him if it were to come out. Or maybe there's a map clearly demonstrating an excellent ambush point to give the party the upper hand in the confrontation. The story will progress whether they make the check or not, but succeeding means earning an extra bonus that could favorably impact just how the story plays out. The third situation is when you're determining the degree of success or failure. This is especially common with complex tasks that call for multiple checks. The more checks that are passed, the greater the reward for success, while fewer checks passed, the greater the loss. An easy example is the gambling downtime activity found in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, in which more successes mean earning more gold while more failures mean losing it. This can be further expanded to also apply to simple checks. Going back to the former example of raiding that bandit captain's room, perhaps there are several other clues which the party will uncover that also lead them in the right direction for the adventure to progress, but to get them they have to delve further into the dangers of the bandit stronghold. In that case, uncovering the clue here and now would save them many resources in the long run, and can reasonably be set behind a roll. A basic success, say a DC 15, might reveal that plot point early, while a greater success, say a 20, might also reveal that extra hidden bit of information to help them succeed in that later encounter. Finally, the fourth reason to use ability checks are moments where the adventurers are trying to do something flashy to show off or gain some minor advantage. The risk and reward here are usually fairly low, but leaving these moments up to chance creates a more memorable happening. We don't tend to remember all the shots Robin Hood made with his bow, but we all remember that time he split the shaft of an arrow by hitting it dead center and claimed the bullseye. He didn't have to do that. He could have simply landed the shot right next to it, for example. But that little bit of extra flair he added made it so much more exciting. But let's face it, that wouldn't have been exciting at all if such things were always destined to happen. We cheer for that moment because it is so unexpected. So in those cases, it's worth adding an element of chance just to raise the stakes a little and elevate everyone's excitement with a bit of tension. Now, when you devour the brains of the heroes, you'll be known as the greatest monster in history instead of the one who beat those otherwise average Joes. It's also important to realize that the mere existence of any of these types of situations doesn't automatically demand a roll. It is the dungeon master who ultimately decides if a roll is called for or not. If something is literally impossible, no roll should ever be made, unless of course it's just determining the possible degrees of failure. In the case of the problematic bard demanding the king hand over his crown, the DM would have been well within reason to simply say no, and that the king will never, under absolutely any circumstances, do something so entirely foolish and out of character. If a roll was called for at all, it would be only to determine the degree of failure, that is, whether the bard can play it off as amusing to the king or be immediately sentenced to the dungeons. In either case, the bard is not who decides to roll, and were they to roll without the approval of the dungeon master, that roll means nothing. The DM only needs to listen to the fates when the DM chooses to consult them. There are also many situations where the talents of the adventurers might come into play, but not necessarily through their active efforts. For instance, sometimes the party is actively looking for something, and the dungeon master might call for a wisdom perception check. But other times the party's just going about their merry way, and they want to know if they notice something or not, such as an enemy ambush or traps in the dungeon. In these cases, if you had the party roll, you'd immediately give away that something is going on, even if the heroes themselves don't immediately know what that is. That kind of meta-knowledge from beyond the realm is sure to affect the world, so instead you can consult passive abilities. A passive ability is determined by adding any ability score and proficiency modifiers to 10. When advantage or disadvantage are applicable, you add or subtract 5 respectively. This most commonly comes into play when dim light is involved, since it imposes that -5 disadvantage to passive perception. On that note, it is worth pointing out that this is how dark vision works in total darkness. So without a light source, even if those pesky dark vision-equipped adventurers can see, they're not seeing very well. Now, when they blunder right into your traps, at least they'll know it was their own fault. As an example of how all this works, a first-level cleric with a +3 to wisdom and proficiency in perception with a +2 bonus would have a passive perception of 15, and in dim light or total darkness but using dark vision, that would be a 10. That means stealth checks or hidden traps with a difficulty class of 15 in bright light or 10 in dim light or below will always be noticed by that cleric. That might sound a little frustrating to a dungeon master eagerly hoping to catch the group off guard with those kinds of traps, but it does make sense for a seasoned adventurer to be really good at noticing these kinds of things. And those encounters don't need to be ruined simply because they've been uncovered. Instead of a trap being little more than a boring hit point tax on the party, it's now an obstacle they have to cleverly decide how to deal with. Does the rogue risk trying to disarm it with thieves' tools? Do they dare set it off with a 10-foot pole or try to trip it with a mage hand? Where will the effects of the trap fall when it's set off? What will it even do? Now you've created an entire exploration encounter, risk and all, out of what otherwise might have been an unimpressive bit of damage. So don't feel bad if a highly perceptive group of adventurers doesn't fall for all of your tricks. Just put more complicated tricks in their way and watch with glee as they agonize over how best to get around them. And besides, with that -5 from dim light, the party needs to make a difficult choice between being stealthy but blundering into your traps and missing secrets, or lighting a torch to give away their position, but at the benefit of not missing anything important. So if passive perception is really cramping your trap-heavy style, make sure your dungeons aren't especially well lit. You should also take passive checks into consideration when describing something new, or when role-playing, through the voices of your minions. If someone in the group has high enough passive insight, for example, they might notice the tells of a lie even without having reason to doubt what's being said, prompting that active insight check to determine what more specifically in the conversation is being lied about. Or a high passive investigation might inform how you craft your narrative of new scenes, allowing you to tell the heroes what kinds of deductions they make from the clues before they ever actually have to make any rolls to find them. You can do the same with any ability check, and so it can be useful to keep those passive numbers in front of you and take them into consideration when you create your world. It will make everyone feel more like their chosen talents are meaningful when they crop up from time to time, even if they're not actively using them. You might also want to consider what sorts of checks you use. Most skills come naturally tied to specific ability scores. For instance, athletics is by default a strength check, while stealth is usually dexterity. But that's just to simplify things for the most commonly expected use of those skills, and you don't have to use them that way. For instance, in a test of stamina, such as swimming across an entire bay or running a marathon, you might replace strength with constitution, making it a constitution athletics check. Or if someone is trying to hide by blending into a crowd of people and acting like they belong, you might call for a charisma stealth check rather than using dexterity. Mixing things up like this both keeps the heroes on their toes and encourages more dynamic and creative adventures for you to brag about at your next annual villain symposium. If you'd like a little more official guidance on these kinds of situations, we can consult our excellently vision-endowed friend Xanathar and his guide once again. All this is up to interpretation, of course. A valid argument could be made for that stealth charisma check to instead be a performance charisma check, since it's all about acting like you belong as part of the group. And I think there being some ambiguity here is a good thing. It gives both the heroes and Dungeon Master wiggle room to make the world behave as they want it to. My personal view on this is not exactly consistent. In the case of the Constitution Athletics check, I, as the DM, would have called for that to better describe reality of what the check is representing. Endurance. But I also try to allow the adventurers to gain the benefit of their chosen skills as much as possible, so those decisions feel meaningful and help them contribute. So in the case of blending in with the crowd to disappear, I'd go with whichever skill the character was best in, stealth or performance, since it makes sense for either to apply. When it comes to deciding whether to use a default or variant ability check, you should take into account all of the variables going on. It's also one of the situations where the heroes should be allowed to argue their case for why they're using one skill or ability over another, and the final decision should reflect both what the Dungeon Master thinks is most appropriate and the intent behind the person rolling the dice. Now you can, of course, just always use the defaults if that's easier for you, but I don't personally think that matches the reality of what happens over the course of any given adventure. The more creative the heroes are, the more likely you are to see the need for those unusual checks, and I think using them adds another layer of interest to the world. Instead of seeing ability checks as the standard ability score plus proficiency, I like to see it from the perspective of chosen actions being built from a mix and match of choosing one of each. When an action is declared, it's an opportunity to ask how they want to attempt it and then choose the appropriate skill and ability score. The next consideration in how you call for your checks is whether it's being performed by one or more people. Different circumstances might call for different types of checks. This breaks down into 3 categories: individual checks, checks made with the help action, and group checks. The most common ability checks you'll probably encounter are individual checks, those made by a single creature, and they're the simplest to handle. Just roll the d20, add the relevant ability modifier and proficiency bonuses where applicable, and if the number beats the difficulty of the check, it succeeds. But you may sometimes run into complications when that check results in failure. The most common issue you'll face is dogpiling, where everyone else in the party queues up to take a turn, each piling on to the check, expecting to take turns rolling until someone succeeds. But here's the thing, that's fundamentally a meta issue. The heroes don't know the roll was bad. Remember that the heroes are experts at what they do, and when they put their efforts to a task, say picking a lock, they do their very best. When it's also the best in the party attempting it, as is usually going to be the case, that's the best effort anyone could put into it. So when that check fails, I think it's best to not treat it as the heroes failing, but rather extenuating circumstances conspiring to sabotage the attempt. For instance, it's not the rogue who did a bad job picking the lock. She did the very best anyone could do. Instead, that lock was so rusted inside that the mechanism broke, or a previous thief foolishly filed away the pins trying to pick it and now it's inoperable. In any case, when you narrate the failure in this way, it should be apparent to everyone that dogpiling is pointless because even the best efforts of the most skilled member of the group still couldn't get that lock to budge. And you can apply that same logic to most checks. Failure to climb, the cliffside is too unstable for a good grip. Failure to identify a creature, that's because this one is unusual and clearly demonstrating abnormal traits. Failure to convince someone, that's because this entire track of conversation goes against what they believe in and there's no way to convince them otherwise. When the dice say a check is a failure, it's not because the heroes messed up, but because the obstacle was unexpectedly made impossible. Of course, while that does help address dogpiling, it won't stop the next best thing, always being entirely too helpful. It's fairly common to see adventurers attempt to help, as in take the help action, literally any time any ability check is made in order to give it advantage. This is a smart strategy, of course, but it's always struck me as a little strange, and it's something that annoys a great number of dungeon masters. It just doesn't sit right with me, and here's why. For starters, if you were always meant to have advantage on every single check except when you're alone, I think the many rulebooks would have made that much more explicit. Second, whenever an unskilled layman attempts to help an expert at a complicated task, they're honestly just as likely to get in the way as they are actually help. That barbarian who's never seen a spell before he joined the party shouldn't know anything about arcana, any more than the 7-strength wizard should be able to help the barbarian lift boulders. It's just silly on a really basic level. Many DMs resort to simply telling the group that only one check is allowed, but I don't think that's exactly fair. The wizard should be able to help if he wants, but it should reflect just how useless he is at it, and I don't think giving the barbarian advantage properly reflects that. Now, I'm about to do something I almost never do, which is recommend a house rule. I honestly believe that most house rules only exist because dungeon masters aren't fully exploiting the existing rules to their fullest potential. For an example of that, check out episode 2 and how I don't think homebrewed rules governing death are necessary at all. But in this case, having tried dozens of different avenues of addressing this, the solution is the one I've had the most success with, hands and tentacles down. That is, a creature can only help with an ability check if it's also proficient in that skill. Otherwise, they can join in a group ability check, which I'll touch on in a moment. This makes sense on a few levels. First, it further prevents dogpiling because while it increases the number of chances to roll, more rolls might actually make success less likely if the people joining in are bad at what they're trying to do. That also better reflects the reality of being unskilled and trying to help an expert while unknowingly being a burden to them. But it also rewards adventurers who have overlapping skills. For instance, if the cleric has high wisdom and proficiency in perception, while the fighter has bad wisdom but also has the same proficiency, that fighter's investment in that skill isn't going entirely to waste by being overshadowed by the cleric. He's now allowed to help in a unique way that no one else in the party can, by giving the best roller advantage. As for group checks, if you're not proficient but still want to join in, you get to roll your own check rather than giving the best roller more chances. Group checks are handled by comparing each roll to the DC of the check, and if at least half of the party passes, the check is a success. But, well, this is going to be my second suggestion for a variation of the rules. The thing about the default method of handling group checks is they seem to assume that you've got the default party of 4, and that they're all participating. But having different numbers of people involved can have some strange effects on how all of this works. For instance, if there are 2 or 4 participating, half passing means a success. But if you happen to have 3 or 5 involved, your odds are actually worse, needing 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 5 to pass in order to succeed. It's an awkward enough rule if you have an uneven number of people in general, but it's even worse when you're using those group checks in place of the help action for dogpiling. For instance, if one of your 4 adventurers wants to sit out the check because they're not good at it, it actually hurts their odds rather than helping, despite the fact that character would be a burden if they participated. This actually encourages more dogpiling. It also doesn't seem to properly reflect the intent of the rule. It's printed right there with it. The successful characters are able to guide their companions out of danger. The implication is that if you're really skilled at something, your higher checks should help compensate for the poor skills of the rest of the group. But when you need 2/3 of the group to pass, that one high roll does nothing to help the others out at all. Even worse in extreme cases like this. Imagine the DC's 15 and the extremely skilled member rolls a 30, but the other 2 members roll a 13 or 14 respectively. As a group check, this is a failure, despite the fact that the individual could have succeeded easily on their own with that absurdly high but possible 30, which is not reflected in the outcome at all. So instead, many DMs opt to take the average of the party's rolls and compare that to the DC to decide success or failure. In this example, with the half or more rule, the group fails, but with the average roll rule, the party has a 19 on the check and they beat the 15 and pass. Of course, the opposite can be true as well. If the group performs a DC 15 stealth check, for example, where 2 out of 4 get 15s and the other 2 get 2s, the group would pass with the standard rule, but instead fail with the house rule. So there isn't any clear-cut best option here. It's really up to you what you think fits your group and style best. Just be aware of how the numbers play out very differently with different numbers of participants. And of course, there may be times when a dungeon master will call for group checks rather than leaving it up to the party to decide if they're helping or not. This is any time the whole group is participating in the action, like when they're all trying to sneak past the guards or climb up the cliff together. You might also make exceptions to this. Perhaps the party is climbing the cliff, but the wizard has cast Spider Climb on himself. You could choose to have the group check made with only the remaining 3, or you could treat that wizard as having automatically rolled a success and therefore more able to help the others. And that makes sense to do since we want to encourage the spending of resources on our encounters, even the exploration and social ones, so there are fewer fireballs flying around our living rooms. Maybe we're getting a bit into the weeds here, but there is another issue interwoven here, somewhere between dogpiling and being overly helpful, and that is the limitation not only of the help action, but also that pesky cantrip guidance. These are fantastic tools for increasing the chance of success, but it's not uncommon to see the heroes become a little overzealous with the application of them, even to the point where some DMs consider taking more serious steps against it. I myself am guilty of having just recommended a house rule to address it moments ago. But as I'm so fond of saying, you don't really need to do that if you just take the rules fully into account. There are limits to how much you can help, the most obvious entailing distance and time. A help action is just that, an action, and the guidance cantrip lasts for only a minute. What does that mean for helping with a longer-lasting ability check, then? Like someone trying to sneak around all the guards and then up into the watchtower to disable the alarm horn. Sure, it might only be one stealth check being made, but its effects could be felt for several minutes, say 10 or 20 in this example, as the adventurer skulks his way to perform his sabotage. If you're thinking that seems a little odd then, that a pep talk right at the start should affect the whole activity, then I find the thoughts in your brain delicious or, agreeable. There are plenty of ways to handle this, and they're all entirely situational, but here are a few. First, don't handle this as a single ability check situation. Instead, make this a challenge, say with 5 distinct obstacles for the rogue to overcome, with each failure getting him closer to being caught. Passing, say, 3 out of 5 means he completes the mission. In this case, the help or guidance is only effective for the first check, giving him a small boost without skewing numbers across the board. But maybe you don't really want to make that many rolls or focus so much attention on only a single hero while the others sit on the sidelines, and you like the idea of using only that initial stealth roll. You might choose to make a judgment call that the advantage or boost from guidance expires at some point when the sneaking member is beyond the influence of the helper or the duration of the spell has expired. In that case, you'd just switch over to the first die rolled as if there were no advantage, or deduct that bonus d4 when checking against future obstacles. If you're not quite sure where the limits of a help action might be, consider asking how the partner intends to help. Maybe they're making a distraction to draw away some guards. Great, that explains the precise limits of the help, because once past those distracted guards, there's no more benefit. But specifically when it comes to the kind of heroes who are a little too much in need of a divine hand-holding from guidance, it's important to remember that using it is casting a spell, one with both verbal and somatic components at that. It's a blatant, obvious thing that's happening, and anyone in ear or eye shot is going to be immediately alerted. There's no casting guidance right before negotiating with the king, because his guards will tackle you for wielding potentially dangerous and unsolicited magic in his presence. There's no giving the thief's fingers magical help to open that lock without the guards around the corner wondering what all the commotion is. Remember, it takes concentration, so there's no holding on to those already cast buffs like Bless if you want to switch things up with guidance. And ultimately, remember that it takes an action to cast, not a reaction. So if the action they want to boost is already happening, it's already too late. Enforce the rules of spellcasting and common sense consequences to them, and most of the exploitation of guidance simply goes away entirely. The heroes are enough of a thorn in your side without letting them cheat their way around the laws of magic. All of these tangentially related conversations bring us back to the final part in all this, which is what success or failure actually looks like. I know, I've covered that in other places, but there's a bit more to say. That being what a natural 20 or 1 looks like, and what success might actually mean in practice. First of all, it's vital that everyone understands that a 20 or 1 does not mean automatic success or failure in ability checks. Critical hits only apply to attack rolls, full stop. In reality, a 20 on the dice, but a -1 modifier is still just a 19. That's the best effort that creature can make, but it's not the best effort possible. In fact, a different person with expertise in that skill and a high ability score might get that same 19 on a roll of only 8 or 9. On the opposite end of the spectrum, one person might roll an 11 and that be their best result, while a more talented competition could get that same 11 on a roll of a natural 1. Should be pretty obvious that with ability checks being heavily weighted by ability scores and proficiency bonuses and things like expertise, that it's silly to focus so much on the number on the die, and more important to look at the final result. But what should that result look like? Well, the DC is set at the very beginning, so passing that means the intended action is a success. It's really as simple as that, but many adventurers and dungeon masters alike have this tendency to overthink things. What happens when the DC is 15 and the resulting check is a 30? It's tempting to say that some kind of ultra super mega success happens, but that can lead down a rabbit hole to its own set of issues, the same as with that natural 20 thing. The king isn't going to hand over his crown no matter what you roll. If you have multiple degrees of success, for instance at 15 and 20, the result of 30 is going to get the best possible result, but it shouldn't result in inventing new, additional, simply absurd extras. And there's good reason for that. Aside from the King's Crown issue, giving extreme rewards to extreme roles only rewards a very specific type of adventurer, one that's extremely stacked at that skill. It means that for most members of the party, the vast majority of other character builds, that those roles are simply impossible and those extras will forever be out of reach. It runs the risk of it looking like you're playing favorites with one person over the others, and it can lead to some hurt feelings. And let me tell you, hurt feelings do not taste good in your brain smoothie. It's also important to understand what the limits of a skill are. You can't jump to the moon no matter how good at athletics you might be. That should be pretty obvious. But then why is it that so many people treat something like persuasion as full-on mind control? As a mind flayer, I can tell you that without a lot of psychic prodding and magical manipulation, people will not do outrageous, out-of-character things no matter how nicely you ask them. Even under the effects of spells like Friends or Charm Person, you only get someone who's at their most receptive to what you say, not someone you can outright control or make do things they wouldn't otherwise do. Magically charming those adventurers isn't going to make them get into the cooking pot on their own. Believe me, I've tried. This logic applies across the board to all skills. You can't roll history to recall the lore of an ancient civilization that's been gone for thousands of years before you were born. You're going to get bits and pieces at best. You can't reattach someone's head with a medicine check, but you could set a bone in a broken leg or stabilize someone who's dying. You can't convince the king to hand over his crown, but you might be able to get him to provide for your adventuring party as your patron. Keeping your expectations for ability checks grounded will avoid most of the pitfalls that come along with them. That's all been a lot about how ability checks work, but there's still a very important piece missing, and that's how you set your DCs in the first place. The official guidance is that DCs range from 5 to 30, with 5 being the easiest and 30 being nearly impossible. I find that the moderate to hard range of 15 to 20 tends to be the sweet spot for most common ability checks that will test the heroes in the first 10 levels or so of their adventure. Though, as they grow in power and level, they'll certainly be attempting more and more interesting things. It's one thing to pick a lock or climb a cliff at lower levels, but it's another entirely to open the gates of the underworld or hold open that closing castle's portcullis. For those more epic, higher-level moments, the 25 to 30 range is more appropriate. It's important that you set the DC based on the complexity of the task and not with regard to the actual heroes performing them. A trap many dungeon masters fall into is setting the DC higher or lower on a whim, depending on which member of the group is attempting the task. But that doesn't make sense at all, and it takes away from what makes those individuals special. If the DC is 15 for one person and 20 for another, it does beg the question of why. Often the higher DC is set for an adventurer who's better at the task, but that's penalizing someone for investing their limited features into a skill while rewarding someone else for neglecting it. It's unfair and unfun, so don't do it. The DC reflects the difficulty of the task in its own right, not relative to the skill level of the party. If someone has advantage and expertise in doing that thing, they should pass more often than anyone else. And some tasks that are difficult for others should be ridiculously easy for an expert. The chosen skills of the heroes will make different challenges more appropriate for different members of the group. An unskilled person might even fail an easy task half of the time, while someone with expertise might be entirely incapable of failing, and that encourages teamwork and participation from everyone. Thanks again for joining me here to listen to my ramblings. If you enjoyed them, leave a like with a tavern keep, and if you'd like more content like this, subscribe and turn on notifications, because I hope content like this is the help action to your DMing check.